Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. On the show, I help yoga teachers make sense of the parts of teaching that often feel harder than expected, especially around anatomy and how to apply it to your cues and your sequences, and how to truly feel confident when you're teaching your classes. Here, you'll learn easy, practical ways to understand anatomy using my step-by-step blueprint and how to apply it directly to your cues and sequences so teaching feels clearer and more grounded so you feel present and more confident. We'll also talk honestly about the inner side of teaching, things like self-doubt, growth, and what actually helps you feel confident over time. You can find daily videos and additional support over on my Instagram and my TikTok channels. On both those platforms, I'm at Bare Bones Yoga. All right, let's get into today's episode. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 390. So today we're going to be going into part 2 of my 4-part series on what can help you build your confidence as a yoga teacher. And another way to frame it is the 4 pillars, what I call the 4 pillars of confident teaching. So if you missed last week's episode, go back and take a listen to it. It'll partner well with this one. Last week, we started out by talking about cueing. And today we're going to be talking about sequencing. So I want you to think about almost like pillars of a house: cueing, sequencing, understanding anatomy, which is really understanding movement, and mindset. And those will be the 4 parts of this podcast series. So if you stick with me until the end, you'll leave at the end of the month. I'm recording this in the entire month of February 2026 with a really good, solid understanding for what really truly helps build confident yoga teachers. And sometimes I know for teachers, they feel like they have so many things on their mind, so many balls in the air, so many things they need to be in charge of, that it's hard to know, where am I supposed to be actually focusing? What's going to give me the most return on investment in terms of how I feel as a yoga teacher when I'm teaching my classes? So that's what this series is all about: helping direct your focus and your energy to the things that really matter when it comes to you feeling confident, you being able to make a bigger impact, and the people who come to your classes really feeling like they're in competent hands when it comes to teaching. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about sequencing. Before I go into that, though, I wanted to just share a quick story with you, because I had a one-on-one call this week with one of the teachers in the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator program, and something she said just really struck me. We started our call by me asking her what would she like to most focus on in this one-on-one call. And she said, well, I have a really clear goal in general for my classes. And I said, oh, great. Well, what is that? And she said, I'd really like to help my students by helping them get into better alignment. And the reason that just struck me is because that is ultimately the definition of what it means as a yoga teacher to make a huge impact. Because when you help your students through your cueing get into better alignment, not only do they hopefully feel better in the posture, but you are literally at the level of their joints and their muscles and their tendons and their ligaments. You're literally creating better strength where they need it, better length where they need it, better joint mechanics where they need them. You're putting them in better alignment helps work against a lot of postural misalignments that they probably have all the time. And so even if you didn't understand the anatomy of moving someone into better alignment, you would be having those benefits. But when you understand anatomy, now when you give somebody a corrective cue, you understand what are the muscles I'm helping to strengthen in this pose. What's the compensation I'm working around by having the person get into better alignment? So in our one-on-one call, what we did was she came prepared, which was great, with a number of scenarios that came up over and over again in her classes in terms of people being out of alignment. And we broke down each one. What's happening? What's the misalignment? What does that mean in terms of muscles that are underactive, muscles that are overactive? And then the application part. How can I actually apply this to these scenarios in my teaching? Well, you're going to do that through the cues that you say. But the cues that you say are now informed by the anatomy you understand versus just teaching to the shape. And so when we went through those different scenarios and I shared the anatomy behind them and we talked through different ways to cue, it was just a light bulb moment for her. And so I wanted to share that, especially because last week's episode was the one on cues, to really sort of round out that conversation with a real life example of what a particular yoga teacher experienced in one of my coaching calls as part of the accelerator program, driven by her own articulated goal that I want to help my students um, feel better in the poses by coming into better alignment. And so I'm curious for you, is that something you can relate to? Is that a goal that sounds like something you might also have for your classes, helping people get into better alignment? So I wanted to just start with that. So as far as sequencing, let's get into this part of the conversation. As far as sequencing, I'm going to just start with a question for you. Do you ever finish writing out a sequence and still wonder if it's good enough? Because I hear this from teachers a lot, this questioning, this second guessing. Is my sequence good enough? I even hear from teachers that they'll have that thought pop into their head when they're actually in the middle of teaching the class. I remember one time a teacher shared with me, I don't think my sequences are good enough for the studio I teach at because the studio is in a really affluent neighborhood. And I think that the sequences I'm offering don't give students their money's worth. And I was just really blown away by that statement because that's that statement illustrates a real doubt in the yoga teacher and a doubt that my sequences are good enough in terms of value. I mean, this is an example of somebody who's making a direct correlation between the sequence they offer and the money the people are paying to go to her classes. And when you think about the kind of pressure that that puts on a teacher, that's a tremendous amount of pressure. And when you think about the doubt around the sequence the teacher is teaching, that teacher has a lot of doubt that the sequence is quote unquote good enough. So this feeling of, I wrote out this sequence, it's the sequence I'm going to use for my class this week, but I wonder if it's good enough. That is something that is really common. And so if you're feeling that, I want you to know that many times the source of that questioning comes from this anatomy learning gap, this wondering, do these poses fit in the right order? Do these poses make sense? I've had many calls with yoga teachers where that's been what they want me to do. Can you look at my sequence and tell me if all the poses are correct, if they're in the right order? And so this brings up this overall theme. Is there a right way to put a sequence together? And I know that you have the books, and I know that you've gone through training where people have held out a particular way to sequence. I really want to ask you though, is that the right way? Is there a right way? And I think the reality is there isn't a right way. We can certainly make the case when we understand movement, understand anatomy, as to the order of poses, that some things go better before other things. But ultimately, you can sequence things however you want. It's just a matter of your understanding of anatomy and the logic that supports what it is you're actually doing. So let me just give you just a couple of other examples that sort of highlight this. And one of them has to do with when a teacher is confident in their own practice. In other words, when I create my own sequence on the fly for my own practice, when I'm practicing at home, I feel really confident doing that. But when I go to create a sequence for my classes that I'm teaching, I don't feel as confident. And so this is something to look at, and it certainly highlights one of the sort of thought processes that teachers have sometimes, which is they confuse their own practice and teaching. Yes, you are a student and you are a teacher. It's, as they say, different sides of the same hand, but the skills you need as a teacher are different than the skills you need as a student. And if you're experiencing some self-doubt around the sequences you're presenting, if it's taking you a long time to create your sequences, if you're worried that they're not good enough, this highlights a, you know, this highlights what's a missing piece for you as a teacher, even if all along you're practicing at home and the sequences you're using on the fly at home, coming up with them spontaneously, feel great. This is oftentimes why teachers will do the practice with me approach rather than the walk and talk, because it's just easier for them to practice with their students and have things spontaneously come to them from a sequencing perspective versus going into the room, teaching a sequence they know well by doing the walk and talk. So that's one scenario I wanted to add to this, or sort of make this concept around this sequencing problem come to life. The other one is, and let me just ask you, have you ever been unsure of what to include in your class? This relates back to the story that I was sharing before, where teachers will ask me, can you look at this sequence and tell me if it's right? There's a lot out there in terms of different teaching methods. And a lot of that starts to bring things up around, you have to do a forward fold after you do a back bend, and you don't want people to squeeze their knees into their chest after a back bend. You don't want to do core too early before they're warmed up. You don't want to, all these sorts of rules that lead teachers to be confused around how to build a sequence. And I want you to start to, or I offer you sort of a different frame to think of these things in. And instead of thinking of them as right, these are rules, these are correct rules, this is the right way to teach. Think of them instead as this is just someone's method. I mean, even if we go back to Iyengar and Krishnamacharya, all of these, ancient yogis, they had their own method. They had different methods. So it's really difficult to say one person's right and one person's wrong. It's really a matter of style. And so think about filtering that in, especially when you hear different teachers say, this is the way it has to be done. Ask yourself, well, who are they to say this is the way it has to be done? And the other piece to consider is when we understand anatomy, that never goes out of style. We can always say our sequence is put together with a solid understanding of anatomy, and that's what supports how I put this together, what order these poses are in, what poses I'm offering, right? So that becomes the sort of timeless rationale for your sequencing. Now, one of the other things that comes up, especially when a yoga teacher is unsure of their sequencing, is this desire, I guess I could say, or this behavior to constantly be changing their sequence. And so if that sounds familiar to you, I mean, part of it is often connected to a belief that the teacher has that I have to change my sequence all the time or my students will get bored. But sometimes this changing the sequence all the time can also come from a concern that, well, if I don't change my sequence all the time, my students aren't going to get a balanced workout. If I don't change my sequence, like I said, they are going to get bored. These things are beliefs that are driven from lots of different things, like people they've been trained by, things they've seen on social media or read in articles. And sometimes, or quite often actually, the result of changing your sequence all the time is most likely that it'll just be harder for you to remember it. Matter of fact, it's the weekend of the Super Bowl coming up, and I was reading Tom Brady's weekly email, which I get, which is actually really good. It's a blend of mindset and physical training stuff. And he was talking about as a quarterback, he got to know his plays so well so that when he went out onto the field, he didn't need to think about them so hard. And that allowed him to be clear-minded when it came to reacting with things that were happening that he couldn't have ever expected would happen. And as you can imagine, as a professional athlete, you can prepare all you want, but there's always going to be something that comes up that's unprepared for, unplanned for. And the thing that he was writing about was basically saying, I tried to, when he was playing professional football, now of course he's a commentator, I tried to prepare by knowing my plays so well, so I had really lots of free mental space to manage the unexpected thing that came up. And this is so relevant for us as yoga teachers because when you go in the room and you know your sequence really well, that frees up a ton of mental space so that you can walk around the room, share clear cues, maybe tell a joke here or there, be authentic in whatever way shows up for you. Change things on the fly if you want. But if you're going in and you don't know your sequence well, 90% of your brain power is going to be devoted to thinking about what comes next. So the reframe I want to offer you here is this idea that sequencing, creating yoga sequencing can feel hard when there's no organizing principle behind it, when there's no method behind it, when there's no consistent way that you're creating your sequences. And as a result, you may end up over planning. I mean, so many yoga teachers tell me they spend 2 to 3 to 4 hours a week prepping for their classes. A week. I mean, just two, 4, 6, 8, that's almost 10 hours a month to planning your sequence. I bet if that's you, you would love those 10 hours back. The other thing that we've talked about that comes up a lot when there's no organizing method or principle behind creating your sequence is you second guess yourself. These are the yoga teachers who go in and worry. Are my, am I doing it right? Are students getting their money's worth? And that kind of thought. And then again, like I said a second ago, these are teachers who often practice with their class because their sequence is connected to their own physical movement, and that's the only way they can teach. So let me just briefly step in here and give you just the kind of top line. And this is a lot of what I teach in my program, but here, let me just give you the top line approach to creating a sequence in just a couple of easy steps. Step number one is to identify what's the objective for your sequence. So maybe it's a 60-minute class, good for all levels of students with a high degree of accessibility in terms of the poses I'm going to present. Maybe that's it. And then step two is identify the sections of the sequence that you want to include. So maybe things like sun salutations, balances, back bends, hip openers. And then step three is for each section, decide what poses you're going to teach for each section. And that is it. 1, 2, 3. But notice that it flows really cleanly. You start with the objective, you go to the sections of the sequence, and then you go to the poses in each section. So each thing flows from the overall objective. So it's all tied together like a nice package. So I want to ask you a couple of just reflection questions now that we've talked a little more about sequencing and just talked a little bit about some of the problems that teachers tell me about, a quick approach that you can use. First question is, how long does it take you to plan for your classes on a weekly basis? Okay, so you have that number. Now I want you to multiply that by 4. And now I want you to appreciate that those are hours of time that you're not getting paid for. They're hours of time you're not getting paid for, and they're hours of time you could otherwise be doing other things. So that's step one. Step two, do you trust your sequences are good, are quality, high quality when you're teaching them? Do you trust that you've created something of high value? And then the next question is, do you have logic, rationale, a reason for why you're teaching what you're teaching in your sequence and why the poses are flowing from one to the next, to the next, to the next? Or is it the kind of thing where I'm teaching somebody else's sequence, or I'm teaching what I was trained to teach, or I don't really know why these poses are in the order they are. I was just given this sequence in my 200-hour training, and that's what I'm teaching. So what comes up for you when you think about those things? Okay. So the last piece I want to go over before we wrap up this episode is the following. I've talked a lot about one of the concepts that I love to teach on or teach about, which is the idea of creating a signature sequence. And this idea of creating a signature sequence is connected to what I talked about before when I told the Tom Brady story. It's based on the idea that the more you teach the same sequence, the better at it you'll get. And the better at it you'll get, the less you'll have to think about it. And the less you'll have to think about it, the more brain power you'll have available to deal with the unexpected. But more importantly, even to walk around the room, to see how your cues are working, to assist your students, to think think about something that's, coming up on the fly that you might want to add into your sequence. You'll just have so much more mental space available to do all those things. And the fact is, when you teach a sequence you don't know well, that's going to be where your attention is. I mean, you know that saying, your attention goes where it's most, kind of quote unquote needed. And when you're teaching a class with an unfamiliar sequence, there's no denying that's what you're going to be thinking most about. So this idea of signature sequencing makes sense from a neuroscience standpoint. It also makes sense, though, from the point of view of you developing a brand, you developing a way of teaching, you developing an identity as a teacher. I can think about it too when I think about the couple of nights ago I watched American Idol, and I watched person after person after person come on and sing, and oftentimes they were singing songs that were popular by another artist or by a well-known artist, and they were a unknown person artist. And a lot of times, as they do on American Idol, they make the song their own. So even though they were singing somebody else's song, it was really memorable because of the way they made the song their own. I mean, there's only so many notes and so many ways to put together the notes. So the challenge for a singer is how can I put these together so that people remember me? And it's always interesting to me when I watch the show and the judge says something like, "I'm going to remember this episode. I'm going to remember this performance like way into tomorrow and the next day and the next day." And I'm curious, for you, do you want to be the kind of teacher where people come to your classes and they just kind of think, "Oh yeah, this was yoga"? Or do you want to be the kind of teacher where people feel like it's a really memorable interaction they had with you? And one of the ways to do that is to have a signature style, to have a signature sequence, to be able to share the anatomy behind your cues, to be walking around the room, to be changing things, in terms of how you're saying the cue on the fly in response to, in real time, what's happening in the room. So these ways of being, these teaching techniques are really only possible for a teacher when they're teaching something they know well. And that's part of a large part of this whole signature sequence teaching methodology. And the way that I call it a signature sequence is because it's meant to be like your signature. Nobody else signs your name the way you do. And so when they come to your yoga class and they take your sequence, that's your signature. And so, you know, does it mean you're going to teach literally the same sequence for your whole life? Of course not. But it does mean that you have a particular style, that you have definitely a signature sequence, maybe a handful of sequences that you like to teach, that people know you for. And there is nothing about that will lead people to be bored or will lead people to think your classes aren't challenging enough, right? And quite frankly, even if someone does come to your class and feel like, "Oh, we did this sequence last week and now we're doing it again. I don't like this," they can find another class. You're not the teacher for them. Why should you change your sequence to meet the assumed concern of a random person who comes to your class? But this is the kind of thing that yoga teachers do all the time. They will tell me the things they're doing because they're assuming people feel a certain way. And let's face it, no one has the exact same people coming to their class all the time. So that doesn't even exist. You will always have these random groupings of people coming to your classes. Some have been before, some it'll be their first time, some come every once in a while. I mean, let's face it, most people go to a yoga class that fits into their schedule. I mean, most people probably don't go to a yoga class that's most desired to them in terms of who's teaching it. It just is they go to a class that works for their schedule. So, you know, you jumping through all these hoops to try to meet the needs of these imaginary people out there. And I don't mean imaginary like they're not real people in your classes. I mean these people you don't even know. You don't even know what their preferences are. And I'm just sort of taking this to kind of the next logical step and breaking it down a lot because I want you to see how the concerns that you might have really don't hold up from a logical perspective. And that's not to say that they're not real feelings. But once we start to shine a light on them, you can see that they just don't hold water. And wouldn't it be better to shore yourself up, to give you the support you need in terms of an approach you're using? Because you're the constant. You teaching every week that particular class on Tuesday night or whatever it is, that's not changing. Who is showing up is the variable. That is changing. So we don't want to try to shore up the stuff that's variable. We want to try to shore up the piece that's constant, which is you. You're always there. You always are showing up to teach them. So you need to you need to be in a position of, I can help people who come to my class. I am confident when I'm teaching my class. And teaching a signature sequence is one of the best ways to do that. So if you're curious about how to create and teach a signature sequence, you're welcome to take a look at the show notes. I'll include the link there to a short training video I have. Now, next week, when we do part 3 of this 4-part podcast series, we will be talking about movement, applying anatomy to movement. And this is for so many people the piece that they know they don't understand. And it's actually the piece that affects everything else. So I'm looking forward to really, sharing that piece with you. And then the final thing I'll say, especially because I started out this conversation with you talking about a phone call I had with one of the teachers or a Zoom call I had with one of the teachers in the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator program. I will include the link to the program in the show notes. And if you're curious, especially if that story sparks something in you, take a look. I'm recording this episode on, did I tell you the date? On, let's see, the date is February 5th. And this episode is going to go live on February 9th, 2026. And so it's the beginning of the month. So if you're listening to this episode in sync for the most part with when I am recording it, you're somewhere in the beginning of February. And because the accelerator program is a 30-day program, if you were to enroll in the beginning of February, you'd be done by the beginning of March. So a lot of teachers do like to enroll in the beginning of the month because they like to have it be in sync with sort of the calendar. So they basically use a 30-day month to complete the program. Now, having said that, if this is not a good time for you, you have other things going on, you can enroll when the time is right for you. But I wanted to just mention that if you are listening around the beginning of February, it is a time when teachers do enroll because they like the idea of a 30-day program being done at the end of the month. So the link to the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator is in the show notes. And if you've made it this far, you've listened to the whole episode, and I really thank you for your attention and your focus. And I look forward to sharing more with you in this 4-part yoga series. We'll cover anatomy next week, and that's what we'll be talking about next week. For now, have a good rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next week. Namaste. Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. If anything we talked about resonated with you, especially around anatomy, cueing, or feeling more confident when you teach, I want you to know that you are not alone. A lot of teachers tell me these are definitely challenges for them. As a thank you for being a podcast listener, I'm offering you $50 off my 4-week Yoga Anatomy Accelerator program. It's a short, focused program designed to help yoga teachers learn anatomy in an easy step-by-step way and how to apply it directly to their teaching. To get the podcast listener discount, you can head over to my Instagram and just send me a DM with the words podcast offer. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.